Are you struggling to create an intentional headspace, unable to connect deeper with yourself? Come, and together let's address the elephant in the room. I'm your host, Sinead Roche, and this is the Uncomfortable Podcast. I feel like in 2026, I have gotten to the point where sometimes I'm really tired of being really understanding towards people. And this is not to say that I am, against putting myself in other people's shoes and seeing their perspective and understanding that perspective. No, but what I mean is I'm really tired of being able to see where someone is coming from, especially like when we're in conflict situations, and also understand my point of view. But because I feel like, okay, this person has these emotions, and I've really dug into why this might be the reason or something, or actually beyond, I don't even have to dig into it, like this person just is experiencing this, then sometimes what I have this big tendency to do is to repress my own emotions, especially when we're in these conflicts, or just put my feelings aside and basically make them kind of like the center of the stage. And in the end, like I oftentimes like resent them because I did that, and I'm doing it myself, obviously. It's like not like anyone has told me to do it. But I end up resenting the person in the end of it. And also, I feel like at the end of it all, like I'm overstepping my own boundaries and I'm downplaying my own emotions. And it's often at my own expense. And I feel like if I'm going to become the person who I want to become, which is someone who is strong, someone who is still understanding, but still has boundaries and understands that maybe sometimes it's okay, not sometimes, it is okay for me to experience quote unquote negative emotions and show those negative emotions, then I have to deal with the fact that I sometimes have empathy fatigue, and I need to understand how I can prevent this from happening in the future. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And before I really get into what empathy fatigue is, this is not an episode to tell you to reduce your empathy. Absolutely not. I think empathy is a really beautiful thing that us as humans, we are able and capable of doing. What I'm saying is that sometimes we have to understand that there are levels to this, basically. And that even if we have basically the ability to be as empathetic, and to really take ourselves out of the equation and see how another person is doing, I think sometimes we need to limit that capability, basically. And also just like remember that we also, even if we have like whatever high emotional like intelligence, that it doesn't excuse the fact that we put ourselves down, basically, and like we prioritize the other person, especially when it comes to conflict situation. And at the end of this all, you do it for you, but you also do it for the improvement of your relationships. Because I feel like, and I'll come to this again in the end, but someone who is constantly repressing their emotions in order to appease other persons and in order to, really understand what's going on with the other persons is not someone who's really showing them fully, like in a relationship or in these relations with other persons. Because if you cannot express, how you're actually feeling, then you're kind of putting up a front. And I know it's a very vulnerable thing to do, to actually express certain emotions, but I think that's something we need to do in order to protect ourselves in some sense, show up for ourselves, and also ensure that we're actually building like connections with vulnerability and also who we are authentically. But maybe I've kind of gotten ahead of myself. So before we really come to some key takeaways from this, let's learn about what empathy fatigue even is. And empathy fatigue is, I think, best is described as like that feeling of I'm feeling too much. And sometimes it can be looked at as like, I guess the person who is absorbing like everybody else's trauma, everybody else's issues. It's oftentimes like I think can be associated with like the listener of the group and stuff. And what ends up happening, when they get so much information and so many emotions like at them, and I'm talking about this right now in like a non-conflict scenario, I think that as much as they want to care for other persons, it's often at their own expense, because feeling so much all the time from other persons or prioritizing other people's emotions, it can be really draining physically, mentally, and emotionally. And I know that can be seen as like a really positive characteristic to have, to be as empathetic as possible. And as great as it is, to be able to put yourself in someone else's perspective, I think because there's levels to this, when you overstep your own boundaries, your own capacities with it, and you, have this inner belief that you need to reduce how you feel or make sure that the other person is okay, then I think it becomes really crippling. And I think that's when we start to resent other people. And I think also build up more resentment towards ourselves for our inability to really stand up for ourselves. And I think people who really are known to experience empathy fatigue are especially like people pleasers, because you want to ensure that everybody in the room is okay. And yeah, it's usually comes with a cost, and the cost is you. And I think it's also people who have, really maybe like high emotional IQs, but at the same time have low boundaries with that. And it's also people who are afraid of being seen as selfish and afraid of like showing other parts of themselves other than the positive parts. And I think it's also having to do with people who are afraid of experiencing rejection, because naturally, if you're going to show something and show an emotion, or like basically when you're in these confrontations, maybe like you do stand up for yourself and you're like, hey, I understand this, that you might be feeling, sad in some way, but this also kind of was like disrespectful towards me. I think because there's like that confrontational moment, or that moment where you guys are just like knocking at each other's heads basically, then yes, sometimes people are not able to handle the fact that you have these emotions, and the possibility of rejection is there. And I think a lot of us try to avoid that, which is, I think, really natural, because you want to be accepted by other people. But if people can only accept you when you're bending over backwards for them emotionally, then they're not really even seeing the full you. And to some degree, you're being taken advantage of, because why they're accepting you is the fact that you allow them to basically be like the center of it all and have their emotions so prioritized that yours don't matter as much. And you've kind of made that also like a standard, because you've shown yourself that your emotions don't even matter as much. And that's why we need to talk about this, because when it comes to empathy fatigue, I think it's attached to like a lot of different, deeper issues. I don't want to say issues, but yeah, a lot of deeper issues. And I think it would be really nice if, we understood that we have self-worth, and that we are like worth like having our feelings valued. But I think we only realize this over time through displaying actions that align with that type of mindset, to actually bridge that gap between what you think is happening versus what like the actual reality of it is. And because a lot of us don't feel sometimes like, oh, our emotions mean as much, or at least I've felt like this, that sometimes, oh my gosh, this person, they're experiencing all of this at the same time. Maybe I should like, of course, take that into consideration, but I go beyond the step sometimes of just taking that into consideration, and I make that everything. And so you show yourself as well that because this other person's experienced something negative, which we all are going to experience something negative, and this is of course context dependent and dependent on scenarios and intensity, of course. but you kind of show yourself that in that moment, you don't matter as much, and constantly showing yourself this, that feeling that comes with it as well, that feeling of like, repress the emotion, of let it like kind of submerge. I think that's terrible to do, because that shows yourself once again that you are not that much of value, and it's also showing the other persons. And I think what it also does, because if you've seen someone going through a hard situation and maybe they have kind of been like, I guess, neglecting you in some sense, or just it's been kind of negatively impacting you in some way. Of course, this is context dependent of how the situation looks and what's been happening, of course. But what I think oftentimes occurs, and I've already talked about this like in episode 33 from season 1, which is about what it means to, if you choose to do something good, then do it because you want to do something good and not because you expect it in return. And I think what happens is that because you assume that people will do the same, like in the sense that if you experience something bad or whatever, and you maybe have like negative reactions towards that, and it's impacting like your relations and whatnot, people are going to be more understanding towards you because in the past you've been understanding towards them. And I mean understanding in the sense of like not taking your own like emotions, like understanding in the sense of they understand where you're coming from, and they therefore will also repress their emotions. But I think that's a really negative point of view to have on it, because you're kind of expecting that this person will have the same mindset as you, and that they're going to return the same like energy towards you. And I think that's what then also leads us to resenting people that we've been really empathetic towards and really caring towards, and hearing about all like, what's going on in their lives, because you assume that 100% they're going to do the same thing. And again, that's where I think it's hurting your relations as well. So with that said, how can we actually fix this, or what can we do to like maybe take note of where we even are at with our capacity and with our empathy and our emotions? And I think it's really important to understand that we want to still remain safe spaces for people. I believe people who are the ones who normally experience empathy fatigue in non-conflict situations are normally the listeners, and are normally the people where they don't judge others and where they are really there for other people. And I think that's so nice. Like, to be considered a safe space I think it is such a privilege and it is such an honor. But once again, you can only be a safe space for others if you're also a safe space for yourself. And so this is where my favorite word comes into play: evaluate your capacity. If someone is about to come and tell you like all these big issues, or that this has been happening in your life, and maybe you're stressed with work, studying, school, you have family issues going on, that's a lot to handle. And then even if you're not going to be the one who's actively doing something against their problems, that's still a lot to handle, just to like listen to and really like actively listen. And again, if you're someone who is deemed that person, then most likely you will actually go out of your way to help the person, which is great. But evaluate, please, at first what your capacity is. And I think, and I do this with my friends, I really do try to ask, hey, like, do you have the capacity for this at this moment? Because I know sometimes we're not aware what the other persons are going through at that point in their lives. And so it's really important to take note of that. And I think that's something that's like really great to implement also with your friends, or to just kind of start with like persons who are close to you and who are coming to you constantly, because it kind of sounds really, I don't know, like HR. That's how, when I start talking like with the capacity word, one of my friends, she always says that I sound like a really like human resource person. But it's just about implementing like healthy kind of like check-in with another person before you know, start going in on what's going on in your life, or vice versa, before they start kind of opening up to you. Because again, we love the people who in our lives who are safe spaces, but we also need to make sure that they even have the time right now to be a safe space, and not just the time, but also the capacity to be a safe space. So that's something that I always kind of do, and also want to remind you before you take on the role of being the safe space. With that said, because you are most likely also someone who really wants to help the other persons, which again is great, please remind yourself that when someone is coming to you with problems in a non-conflict situation, again, this is dependent context, but it is not on you to fix their problem. There's a big difference between being a supporting person and being the person who's actually going to actively fix the issue. But of course, this is different given what's going on, and if you even have like the resources. Sometimes it's not also just like an emotional issue, but sometimes it could be like a legal issue, it could be a financial issue, and seeing how we can help there sometimes may be a bit different. But even there, like, that's not on you necessarily. And what I've often found when people are even opening up is, yeah, they do want support, but most times they just really want spaces to vent. And it's not necessarily about you fixing their issue, because they know they can fix their issue. And well, most of the times they know they can fix their issue. So don't automatically assume the role of having to fix it for everybody, because who told you you had to? Genuinely. And I think in some sense, then you also kind of overstep a bit, because just because you're the person people come to when they have issues does not mean you're supposed to be the fixer of their problems. And I think in that sense as well, if people are expecting that from you, then they should also be asking that from you as well. Even if in the past, maybe that's been something that you've automatically done. Honey, you also have your own problems as well that you still need to focus on. And you cannot do that and everything else if you're also focusing on everybody else's issue who's coming up, like, which is being brought up to you. And so those are just some things that I think about, I think about and take note of when it comes to, being the safe person, definitely when I'm being the safe person for other people and being the listener, so that I also understand that how can I take care of myself in this moment. And because I know it's really hard to get out of habits that you've had for years, what I think would be like maybe a great alternative, or not a great alternative, but just a nice add-on, is that if you are not able to restrict yourself from helping the other persons, then I think it's really important that the same amount of overextension, like of yourself, that you put into helping them, you need to put that and redirect that back into you, so that you kind of like replenish your resources. So I mean that like literally, how much effort you put into taking care of them and their issue, I need you to go and do the exact same for yourself. And you're gonna realize how hard that is to match it. And at the same time, you're gonna realize how much effort you've been putting into helping these other people, which is really great. But also, we need to be able to match that kind of effort. And if we cannot match that effort all the time, then we maybe need to reduce how often or how much we're putting into other persons, because we still need to be able to match, again, that effort for ourselves, so that we can come back to being 100 in that sense. And then in terms of, again, taking inventory, because a lot of this is that you just have to realize that you maybe are the person who is experiencing this, is looking at you where you are right now in life, and maybe what's going on around you. When people are sharing with you, how do you feel afterwards? Do you feel exhausted? Do you feel drained? Do you feel still excited and ready for the day? How long does it take maybe in order for you to come back to yourself and kind of get out of that headspace and go back to doing what you need to do? And I think, again, also in like non-conflict situations, and I've been hinting at this a bit, is like, do you feel as though people are considering you even when they are opening up about their lives? And what I mean by that, again, is like, do they consider if you have other issues going on? Do they think that you need to put everything on pause for them? This is kind of just evaluating how you're basically seen a bit by your friends. And heck, I think sometimes you can even ask persons, like, do they feel that they consider you or whatnot? I think especially if you trust these people at least. But this is just so that you can understand, maybe there is a big difference between, you not putting the boundary up versus people overstepping the boundary on their ends. And so kind of taking that a bit into inventory as well. And now moving away from non-conflict situations and moving into a bit more like when it comes to confrontation, which is what I was talking about before in the beginning, about you feeling the need to repress your own perspective or your own emotions when someone else is going through something hard. And in the end, because you can understand where this person is coming from, you kind of, I don't want to say you give the win to them, but because, oh my gosh, no, I don't want to say you give the win to them, but you definitely do extend so much grace beyond the grace that you're actually able to give. Let's say it like that. I want you to ask yourself, when you're feeling those certain emotions, especially in conflict, do you allow yourself to actually express your emotions or stand up for yourself in terms of communication? And that might be a bit confusing in order to understand. So what this looks like is like having that conversation about actually that situation, and you can understand what that person is going through, but you also understand your own side. And if you were someone who does have kind of like boundaries when it comes to your your empathetic capacity, then you wouldn't diminish your emotions just because the other person has feelings too and may not see your side. And this is where I think it's really important to understand that two perspectives can exist at the same time, and someone doesn't need to automatically be deemed as the bad guy. I think that's sometimes where we need to understand that a lot of times when two persons are kind of, I don't want to say the word upset, but just for, speech sake right now, when two persons are maybe like upset at each other, it's not necessarily that always the people are bad or like someone did something wrong. Sometimes it's that, your actions didn't align with my actions or like in terms of our values. So maybe I value this a bit more than you do. And because of that, there was kind of like we're not aligned in that sense. And so you're not necessarily a bad guy. It just, this is how this made me feel because I value being respected, for instance, like a lot in this sense. And so I think that's something you also need to understand, is that two perspectives can exist at the same time. One does not diminish the other. And so coming back to, understanding if you're actually expressing your emotions when you're communicating about these situations, it's really important to understand that you don't diminish how you feel and what your take is on the situation, just because you can understand what the other person's point of view is. And I think, for me, despite being like a really confrontational person, I am a people pleaser at heart. And what I've seen in the past is that I do have the tendency to repress my emotions. Okay, I don't want to say repress my emotions, but definitely understand where the other person's coming from a bit more and take that in terms of priority. And then because I've kind of repressed my thoughts and feelings because I see that this person is going through so much, even though I'm also going through so much, I feel like I start to resent the persons, and this is something we definitely need to avoid. And I think that leads to just like more like distrust within the relations as they continue on. And that's not actually healthy, and that's not how you build healthy connections either. And so I know I need to work on that. And I think I definitely have since I think I definitely have, but there's definitely a long way to go still. And also along with, why I'm still maybe like struggling with like empathy fatigue, I'm someone who is really often afraid of rejection. And if I can, I would like to put myself into a smaller box to ensure that I kind of fit nice and neatly within these person's lives rather than be myself 100%. And some things that I've had to come to terms with is that, first of all, I most likely will not be able to please everyone, and I'm also not always going to be able to be the listener all the time. And yeah, sometimes I may be rejected from people because I'm experiencing like different emotions, or because maybe we have like different values, and they may be really stuck in why they feel that way, and I'm also maybe like stuck in the way I feel, and maybe there's just like no compromise and no understanding on either of our sides. And with that said, like, then maybe those people just weren't my people. And I also know, and this has happened to me not quite sometimes, but like, I know that sometimes I'll be seen as the bad guy, and I need to be okay with that. And I'm not usually, because I really do want to be seen as a kind person. But again, it's my perspective, and not everybody necessarily has to understand my perspective if they're not willing to. But I do need to understand that if I am going to start showing up with my emotions, that sometimes they're not always going to be taken as well by other people as I would have liked them to be taken. And that means that I have to kind of fight against that pit in my stomach, which is often what I feel like when I am actually able to express myself, and I'm kind of sitting with that discomfort in the room, and the other person is, or not that they assume that I would have just like, said, okay, I'm so sorry, it's all my fault. But when I have to sit with the fact that I'm telling someone how I actually feel, I always usually have this pit in my stomach, and it doesn't go away as easily as I would like to. But I also know, because it is a bit it's uncomfortable to feel like that. I also know that doesn't mean that what I'm doing is bad. It just means I'm expressing myself. I just feel vulnerable at that time. And if you haven't practiced sitting within that discomfort as often, then it's just going to be a bit uncomfortable. And this is where I really have to go into learning how to self-soothe myself. I'll start to journal after, especially when I'm like talking in persons, because even though I'm someone who's maybe like I'm a confrontational person, does not mean I actually like conflict. And I have like documents upon documents, because I cannot write like that well, so I usually type everything, and of just how I'm feeling afterwards, and that kind of self-soothes me. And then sometimes, because I am seeking for reassurance, and definitely if they didn't see my point of view, then I want someone else to see my point of view. And this is something that I've been trying to like lessen of doing just because I also don't want to always want external validation. But sometimes I will call up a friend and ask them like, hey, like, can you just listen to a sec? Do you have the capacity to listen? Because I feel like this is where I'm coming from. I know this is where this person is coming from, but I just want to know that like I'm not doing anything wrong. And at the same time, I think as you start to understand yourself more, and you get into this habit of sitting with that discomfort and of self-soothing, then you don't really need to kind of ask for other person's opinions on whether or not you did the right thing, or on whether or not your emotions were even valid, because that's what you're really asking persons. And so I think that just comes with time, and that comes with practice. And in order to sometimes even get myself into that headspace of like, okay, I don't need to ask other people, my emotions are valid as well. What I've said before, and I'll say it again, is I start to view myself as like my best friend. And again, it's this thing of like, would you, how would you protect them basically? And you understand that you really want to be there. You really want your best friend kind of to feel like their emotions are valid and stuff. And so I'm speaking to myself. I'm also saying like, twin, it's okay. You felt this way because of this. I know right now the other person in this conflict might not necessarily understand that, and that's okay, but that doesn't mean that your emotions are invalid. And so sometimes seeing myself in this way, especially when I don't feel like I deserve to have my emotions like said, because I know the other person is also going through something as well. I think that again helps you to shift perspective basically and start to value, how you're feeling, and also value the fact that you're trying at least to sit within this discomfort. And that's not as easy as it sounds. And in fact, I don't even think it sounds that easy to do. And it does definitely take time to practice doing this and to practice not needing the reassurance from other persons, and maybe not even needing to really self-soothe so often. And I've definitely found myself kind of quote unquote backsliding, in order for me to remain calm. Like I have this big tendency of still over explaining to people and still trying to get them to see my point of view. But sometimes it doesn't matter how many times you explain to other people like where you're coming from, because maybe they just don't understand what that perspective really is. And that doesn't mean though that your perspective is wrong or that it should be invalidated. And I think especially when it comes to those times where you've tried everything to get someone else to see your point of view and to be empathetic towards you, I think it's what you need to understand is that it is so emotionally exhausting bending over backwards for other people, having to suffocate your own feelings. And I think at some point you just start to understand that you don't want to do this no more. So you would rather sit with the discomfort of knowing that someone maybe might not 100% get where you're coming from, rather than having suppressed them completely from the initial beginning when you are going into these conflict situations. And something as I reflect, not just on my own empathy fatigue, but I think also when it comes to me being in conflicts, something that I think about is that deep down, I don't want people to see certain emotions of mine. And I mentioned this in the beginning, because I really do want my image to be curated in a sense that it is positive. It is this outgoing, strong, confident person. And also this understanding person. And I've said this in past episodes where I'm really comfortable with my anger, and I 100% am comfortable with my anger now, but it's not something that I always want people to see. But what you have to understand is that if you really want to build these connections and relations with actual trust, vulnerability, and openness, then you have to also allow persons to kind of view the other parts of you and view maybe not the so pretty parts of you. And I think you're going to understand. I think when you're able to actually show people that, then you can build those strong relations, because people do accept the fact that you have negative emotions, and you don't necessarily have to be this 100% positive, happy go lucky whatever person all the time. That's not even a natural thing. And so I know this deep down, with me at least, has to do with the fact that I really do want my image to be something that is seen as really positively. But who's to say that expressing yourself completely isn't a positive thing. Like, that's really positive, or at least the way I've seen it now, and having shifted my perspective, is that it is really amazing to know people who don't suppress their emotions, and people who are able to, in a contained way, express how they feel, whether that be negative or whether that be positive, because only then do you get to know the person like all around. And I think that's what also makes me trust people at least a bit more, is when I do see them like having these more vulnerable emotions being shown. And I think that's just something, though, again, that you have to work on and sit with and acknowledge to yourself that you do care what people think about you, and that the parts of you that you don't want being shown are also the parts that people do need to see in order to really understand who you are as a person. But that means you kind of have to accept the fact, first of all, that you have these emotions to begin with, and that they are a part of you, which again takes time. Unfortunately, many of these different attitude shifts, they take time, and this is all about, your value and your ability or the possibility of being seen by others and wanting to be understood by others. And all of that takes time. So this is not something that, again, it's just going to be in an immediate, like, oh, now I can just show my emotions to everybody. No, there's definitely deeper issues to consider with this as well. And because we know that takes time, how do we care for ourselves in the meantime? Do we have an outlet, at least, especially as we're sitting through the discomfort of having told persons our emotions? Or do we have like an outlet just for the fact that we have these emotions to begin with, and that for once we're allowing ourselves to kind of like feel this way and, give ourselves more understanding, maybe sometimes even in comparison to the other person who we're having these conflicts with. And so ask yourself if you're even having kind of outlets. For me, for instance, it's really just like working out oftentimes, and also just like taking some alone time, especially like as the person who sometimes feels like there's just so much going on around me and like so much with other people that sometimes like I really just need to focus on myself. And so when I'm talking about like having these types of outlets, I really want you to get into your body with this, because as someone who's also like an overthinker, all we can do with this thinking, like it just goes into like spiraling basically. And at the end of the day, sometimes you cannot really do anything with that, but you should be able to still, I feel like, physically put yourself in a different space, or attempt to, if possible, and really just get back into, your body in some sense, in some way, or put yourself in a different environment, because that can definitely also have a different influence on you as well. And as we come to the end of this, because again, I feel like I've given you guys a lot to pontificate on as well, I believe that you need to understand that when it comes to empathy fatigue, yes, a lot of this has to do with whether or not you are someone who's overstepping your own boundaries. But sometimes you need to also just evaluate whether or not the people who you're surrounding yourselves, who are surrounding you, are overstepping the boundaries that you already set and are kind of taking advantage in that way. And I think that it sucks to say, but this would require more deeper conversations. And if, still understanding is not being met because in the past you've always been willing to compromise your emotions, then sometimes you just have to let certain persons go and kind of, I guess, reimagine or reconfigure what your circle looks like, reconfigure the people who are around you, and put yourself in environments with people who are actually going to respect your emotions. especially if after you've said anything and people are still not understanding in that sense. Because as much as we can do for ourselves, we also cannot control other persons. And unfortunately, sometimes the only thing to do is kind of move on, because again, it's such a great privilege to be the safe space, and it's like such a great thing to be someone who's really empathetic. But if that's not being respected, then you cannot fix that. That's not something on you. And staying in those situations where that's constantly being stepped on will also just diminish how you see yourself. And so all the hard work having gone to, implementing these boundaries and making sure that you understand your capacities, I'm not going to say it's all for nothing if the persons around you aren't, listening to you. But I mean, it definitely is something if you're staying in those situations to a degree. So that's just something also to take into consideration. But with all that said, I know there's a lot of questions already that you need to be asking yourself, or hopefully you've asked yourself throughout this episode, in terms of like taking inventory of like, what it currently looks like to experience empathy fatigue for you, or whether or not you have boundaries, or what that's even looking like for you when you're in conflict situations, if you're actually able to sit with the discomfort. So coming to our last question of the day is, I want you to ask yourself if you ever feel like your I care too much is actually manageable, or if it is suffocating you in non-conflict ways and then in also conflict ways. And the reason that I want you to ask this question is because even after this entire episode, some persons might still think, okay, this doesn't apply to me. But this is where I then think your body can give you a much greater understanding than sometimes your own mind can. And so I really want you to take into consideration your physiological responses when it comes to, being the empathetic person. Are you someone whose body is like completely drained after having heard someone's stories, or you feel like you're just suppressing all your emotions when you're in these conflicts? Because again, if you don't think that you have an issue when it comes to how empathetic you are, then sometimes your body will be able to clue you in before your own mind can and your own understanding can as well. And I think from then you can move on and take the necessary steps in order to ensure that you're practicing empathy in a leveled way, given what your capacity is. But that's it from me, guys. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And I hope that you were able to understand that empathy is such a great tool to have. And at the same time, there's levels to this, and we're just here to work on that and here to work on our boundaries. So thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye. Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Uncomfortable Podcast. Make sure to tune in every Monday for a new episode on Spotify and YouTube, and go ahead and check out our TikTok and our Instagram for more content. Bye.